We are right in the middle of a 4-year process in the negotiations that was started at the Durban climate meeting at the end of 2011. And at that time, among other things, these big meetings are called COPs, the Conference of the Parties. So that was the COP in South Africa. And there was a decision to start a new negotiation that would cover the period of the 2020s, that would be a post-2020 focus, and in which the parties would negotiate an agreement, legal in some way, not clear what the exact legal form would be, but that was supposed to be a legal agreement of some fashion, and applicable to all parties, which was very important. Kyoto was effectively applicable just to the developed countries. So this was going to be an agreement that was going to be applicable to all countries, and that's a quite essential part of it. So that was 2011. The agreement's supposed to be finished in 2015. As it turns out, the big climate meeting at the end of 2015 is going to be in Paris. So we sit right in the middle of that process, about halfway through, and I think that there has been some good progress made, and these negotiations are always difficult.
And I believe the State Department recently put forward some suggestions for a durable and ambitious deal. So explain what that means, durable and ambitious.
Yeah. So, well, ambition is the buzzword in climate negotiations that just means that countries are promising to do a lot with respect to reducing their emissions. So that's ambition is absolute critical part of any climate agreement. So yes, we want it to be ambitious, and that starts with everybody, but most certainly includes the United States. And durable means, there's another word I would add. I would say ambitious, inclusive, and durable. Inclusive gets back to that idea of applicable to all that I was talking about. We have to get all of the players, all of the main players, and even players who are less than main, to be part of the agreement, to agree to take action. And so forth. And durable, we're looking to have an agreement that where we don't go through this whole process every 5 years, or really even every 10 years if we can. We would like to see an agreement that sets out a framework that all countries are part of, that sets up processes to every X number of years, let's say every 5 years, need to put in new commitments to say, if we say just for the sake of argument, because we don't actually know what the end point is going to be for this one, but let's say that we're making commitments to 2030 now, you'd have an agreement that would say each 5 years, or conceivably each 10 years, but probably more like each 5 countries would put in new commitments, and that you would have provisions in there about transparency, about reporting on what countries do, and about review, about accounting for emissions and so forth, that you wouldn't keep renegotiating. You would have an agreement that sets that out and that lasts for a long time. Whether we get that or not, I don't know, but if you ask what the United States is interested in, that's what we want: ambitious, inclusive, and durable.
And inclusive, I think you're really talking about China, India, the big emerging economies, which were in a separate class and at the end of the Cold War when this construct was first conceived. Now they are the biggest, well, China's the largest current emitter. So is China on board to be part of a legally binding treaty?
Well, I was about to say yes until you said legally binding treaty. So China is, I think China and other countries are on board to be part of this new agreement. Now, so let me just stop you for a second on the legally binding. What was agreed to in Durban with respect to the legal nature of it is I'm going to tell you what the exact words are, because they're fairly convoluted, but you'll see that it's not exactly clear how this is going to work. But the agreement was to negotiate a protocol, another legal instrument, or an agreed outcome with legal force. Okay. As you can imagine, those were carefully negotiated words, particularly that last little clause, which was done in a huge and growing, sort of started small, but sort of mushroomed out huddle on the floor of the plenary in the middle of the night on the last day, because basically all countries were ready to accept just the first two pieces except India. And so language had to be found, and we were right in the middle of that, actually helped to find the language that got the deal done. But it's not, it is an agreement that's going to have legal force, that's going to be legal in some fashion, but it might be legally binding in every respect, or it might be something somewhat different from that. And countries have put forth different ideas on that, actually. But yes, to get back to your basic question, I think China and other countries are conceptually on board with doing an agreement, but it's, there are a lot of devils in a lot of details. So
sounds like, yeah, some lawyers are going to be kept busy by all of that. But the question, one other question is whether this needs to go through Congress, or can this be done in a way that doesn't have to be ratified by Congress?
So the answer I always give to that question is that any agreement that we do that requires Senate ratification will be taken to the Senate for ratification. But it all depends on what the nature of the agreement is. So the agreement that we did in the Copenhagen Accord in Copenhagen, and then the essentially expanded version of that was done in Cancun, were not, by their nature, they were not the sort of things that needed to be taken to Congress. So it all depends on the nature of it and on what elements of the agreement are legally binding and what aren't. So yes, we will if that's the nature of the agreement, and if it's not, then of course we won't.
But is it your intention to design something that doesn't need to get through Congress? Because right now the time of day couldn't get through Congress.
No,
so.
it's our intention to negotiate an effective and good agreement that certainly from the point of view of the United States with respect to our interests, but also with respect to the whole world, and with respect to again to get an agreement that can draw in the participation of all of the major players. So no, we don't have any specific intention in that regard, but we just want an agreement that can work and that's strong and good and that people can be part of.
Because President Obama recently have said he's basically going to go around Congress, use executive action, but this is not part of that sort of going around Congress. Executive action, do whatever he can with his own power.
Well, so I wouldn't exactly characterize what the president said that way. I think what the president said is he was looking for Congress to act. If Congress wasn't going to act, it's not so much that he was going to go around Congress. He was going to use authorities that he had. And don't forget, with respect to the most important of those authorities, look at the biggest single thing in the president's very strong climate action plan. Are probably the new regulations that EPA is working on with respect to power plants. It's not that we're not going around Congress on that, and the president's not just using his pure executive authority of the kind that you would use if you were doing an executive order, for example, if the president was doing an executive order. He's relying on congressional previously passed law, the Clean Air Act, which Congress passed, and relying on the interpretation of the Clean Air Act by the Supreme Court. So, that's sort of what the president is doing with respect to domestic action. Yeah. So we're not in a going around Congress mode.
And on domestic action, when you're talking to negotiators from other countries, often, of course, the U.S. is the largest historic emitter. There was some press reports in the last couple of months about the 20 largest emitters. There's like a lot of the emissions have come from a handful, a dozen or so entities. What do countries say about, is the U.S. doing enough? Has the U.S. established climate leadership, climate credibility on this issue when we have been the biggest creators of this problem?
Right. I will say that that the reception that I have seen and the kind of discussions that I've had since the president's speech and announcement of his climate action plan in I think it was June or July, has been very, very good. I think actually the standing of the U.S. Internationally with respect to what we're doing is quite good right now, and I've heard that from any number of countries, including some countries who have not been hesitant to be critical in the past. So, and look, everybody's got to do more. I mean, if you I mean, I only watched a little bit of that tape when I came in, sort of toward the end of that tape, but there's a lot to do, and this is a huge challenge. So everybody's got to do more, and the president, was looking for Congress to do more. But yeah, I think the short answer is that we are in. That I think we're in the best standing we've been in a while.
And what exactly, so you're saying the U.S. has become more of a climate leader, it's earned some of that, and aside from the coal regulations...
Well, we've been a climate leader internationally. I was just talking domestically.
Okay. So what particularly has the U.S. done? Because some climate advocates would say the U.S. is not a leader.
Well, I think that the president, I mean, it's a broad-based plan, and and as I said, I think the sort of single most important element of it are the power plant regulations, but it also has to do with I think
the auto efficiency standards.
Just today, I think the president announced plans for new standards on heavy duty, on trucks and buses. Essentially, the standards that the president already put in place back in, I think, announced in 2009, I think, for the broad vehicle fleet are hugely ambitious. I mean, basically is in the process of taking our vehicle fleet from 27 miles per gallon, a number where it had basically been stalled out for about 20 years, and is going to 54. I mean, that's a huge move for about a third of for the transportation sector, which is about a third of our emissions. Moving in the power sector, we've done a whole lot, and there's more in the president's plan about appliance standards with respect to buildings. Basically, everything that makes buildings work, heating and cooling, and all the appliances within buildings have all been subject to significant new standards, and there are provisions in there about producing renewable energy on federal lands. There's really dozens of elements in this plan. So I think in terms of what a president can do when you have a Congress that is not prepared to act, very strong.
The Keystone Pipeline is linked to a sea change in which the U.S., and partly it's linked to a sea change in which the U.S. is becoming a large energy producer. The International Energy Agency says the U.S. will be perhaps the largest oil producer, surpassing Russia before too long. How's that going to affect the international politics of this, where the U.S. has traditionally been the largest consumer? I don't know many people who would have predicted that we'd be the largest. A few years ago, the U.S. would be such a large supplier. How does that change the oil equation internationally with climate?
Well, look, I think if you step back and think about what needs to be done with respect to climate change over time, and where we need to be trying to push things, now, fundamentally, there needs to be a transformation of the energy base of our economy to much less reliance on coal and oil in particular, and that's I mean, over this isn't going to happen tomorrow, but over a period of time, that's where things need to go, and so that's why renewable energy and energy efficiency alternatives. That's why natural gas, at least as a transitional fuel, is important as well. So clearly, that's what needs to happen. Now, oil is still going to be around for quite some time. while oil is around, is it a useful thing to be able to produce the oil here rather than just import it for national security and other reasons? Probably yes. So I don't think the fact that we can produce a bigger chunk of the oil that we use is in any sense a negative with regard to climate change. The use of oil in general, we've got to get, we've got to reduce significantly over time. But
climate doesn't care where it comes from or where it's burned.
Not fundamentally. Would I rather have oil that we produce here rather than to have to buy it in some of the places that we have to buy it? Sure. The electrification of the fleet, of the auto fleet, if that can happen, would be a big deal, particularly if it can then be combined with the reduction in the CO2 intensity of the power supply. So less use of coal, more use of, in some cases, natural gas, but even better if you can get more and more renewables into the mix. And that's happening. So solar is obviously the cost differential between conventional fuel and solar has dropped just dramatically over recent years. There are innovative companies who are getting solar panels on people's roofs without any upfront cost, for example. It's so greatly expanding the reach of that kind of thing. Wind is actually pretty developed. There's all sorts of further work being done on things like battery storage. When you have solar and wind, they're good when the sun shines and the wind blows, but you also want to be able to store power so that you can get energy even when that's not happening. So there's a tremendous amount of interesting stuff going on.
One striking example some people know about from the film Island President is President Nasheed from the Maldives. He was in New York on the David Letterman show in 2012 and said, look, what happens in the Maldives could happen here in Manhattan. Then came Hurricane Superstorm Sandy,
right.
Very prescient. So I'd like to, is there a moral dimension to this in terms of some countries are just going to go away pretty soon?
Well, I think sure there is. And I don't know how soon is, but there certainly are countries. Islands are the ones that people focus on the most readily, and there aren't large numbers of islands in this position, but there's a number of them that are so low lying that over time and not a huge amount of time they're going to be threatened and. So I think that there's a moral dimension to it, but it's not confined to the islands. I mean, if you're Bangladesh and you have like large numbers of people living within a short distance from a low-lying coast, you've got a huge problem too. And there's many countries that have problems like that.
Political, but China's key to all this. People certainly will have some questions about China. Could the U.S. and China do a bilateral deal like in the old days when Reagan and Gorbachev got together? There were other countries with nuclear powers, but two big countries coming together and do a significant deal. There's been a fair amount of movement recently on China.
Yeah, so I wouldn't say that the U.S. and China will go off and kind of do a soup to nuts climate deal. There's not going to be a G2, and I think China wouldn't want to do that, and I think other countries, and we wouldn't want to do that per se, and other countries wouldn't appreciate it, I think, if we did. On the other hand, I think other countries would quite appreciate the notion of the U.S. and China collaborating more closely together, and we're trying to do that. I was in China with Secretary Kerry last week, and he announced just a short joint agreement that includes the notion of the U.S. and China collaborating essentially in the development of our post-2020 plans, obviously relative to the 2015 agreement. And I think that's, we'll have to see how that collaborative effort plays out. But I'm very hopeful about that. I think that's a really good thing. I mean, something that we proposed, the Chinese, and they were interested and quite open to accepting it. So I think that working together in what we're planning to do, working with them on what they're planning to do, is all to the good. And so very active collaboration, very active working together with China, I think is a very good idea. Going off in the corner to do our own climate, sort of overall climate agreement, that not quite that.
But building trust, developing some leadership, that sort of thing.
Totally.
How about India? India is a little more complicated in terms of its governance. It's a messy democracy. It's an election year. Maybe not quite so much there. What about India in that regard?
Well, India, so two things. First of all, India is obviously very important, but it's important to keep track of the scale of importance of countries with respect to emissions. So China at this point is something like 25% of global emissions. They're a lot bigger than us at this point. Together, we're probably a little over 40%. India, I don't have the exact numbers, but they're probably in the range of 3 or 4. So it's an order of magnitude difference between India and China. Okay, so that said, that doesn't mean India is not important. They're quite important. They are having elections now. I think that we have very cordial relations with India. There was a period in 2009-10 when India was a real leader in the climate negotiations and quite a progressive force. They have been, not sort of pursuing quite that path in the same way in the years since, but we have very, I think, positive and kind of cordial working relations with them, and I think when they come out of their election cycle, they have a new government, whichever party it is, and new people at the helm of their climate effort, we will work closely with them, I'm sure.
Recently Edward Snowden leaked that there was spying going on in Copenhagen on the delegates by the United States. How has this damaged U.S. credibility? Were you aware of this? How are we going to fix it? Thanks.
Oh, I most certainly was not aware of it. No, I mean.
I want to clarify, this was the U.S. was spying on climate negotiators? Is that what?
The gentleman is referring to a story that was, yes, that there was that kind of thing going on that was revealed in the Snowden papers or whatever we're calling them. So no, I mean that's not. I mean that isn't anything that we were focused on.
Did you get grief about it?
I haven't gotten any grief about it. I'm not sure. I think that came out. I feel like that came out recently enough that it was certainly after the big Warsaw meeting at the end of the year. So I haven't had grief about it yet, and I don't actually think there's going to be a lot of focus on that, but I might be wrong. Hi,
Ambassador Stern. I'm Priscilla Imboden. I work as a U.S. correspondent for Swiss Public Broadcasting. I have a question about something you said in the beginning of the talk, where you mentioned that it might not be a binding agreement that it is come to, but maybe another form of agreement that might not have to go through Congress. How likely do you think that will be to avoid a situation like we had in Kyoto, where we have a president who signed the agreement, but it was never ratified by the United States?
Well, just I don't want to be misunderstood. I think this agreement will be legally binding in some ways. I think it's not. I'll give you a concrete example so nobody's confused. New Zealand has proposed, different countries put forward submissions proposing different ideas. New Zealand has proposed, as an example, an agreement where there would be a legally binding commitment to put forward your commitment, a legally binding agreement with respect to some other aspects like reporting that I was just talking about and review and things like that. But the content of, they call it a schedule, so they say a legally binding commitment to put forward your schedule. but the content of the schedule in the New Zealand proposal would not be legally binding. There's still a kind of another variation on that, which would say that the content, or at least much of the content, might be legally binding at a domestic level, even so it would be, you would put forward your laws and regulations and things like that. But it would not be internationally legally binding. So there's all different variations on this. On the question of Congress, it really is going to depend on precisely what the shape is, because in some cases, absolutely, that it would be an agreement that would need to go to Congress, and in some cases that might not be the case. But we just don't, it's way too early to know yet.